Primo Levi arrived at Auschwitz in 1945, he was thirsty. That's something prison camp movies seem to leave out. Hunger is the focus of Schindler's List or Shutter Island, showing Jews in threadbare uniforms that look like pajamas, starving to the bone. But Primo Levi, the award-winning chemist who wrote the periodic table of elements, Primo remembered being thirsty the most, being dehydrated, exposed to the cold almost constantly. His book, by the way, the periodic table of elements, it's the book the Royal Institution considers the best science book ever written. When Primo remembers Auschwitz, he talked about the cold and being thirsty a lot. And most famously, he talked about the unnecessary cruelty of the camp guards. When the men arrived, many of them knew they were going to die. Primo wrote in his book, The Truce, that when they walked in, he asked another prisoner, "Will they give us something to drink?" The answer, of course, was no. They line us up again, lead us to a huge square. The only way out is through the chimney. What does that mean? Primo asked. We'll soon learn very well what it means. The cruelty of allowing the inmates to see the chimneys and gas rooms when they first arrived, that was planned. The horrors of Auschwitz, the cruelty and terror applied by the SS officers, it was all meticulously planned. In another of Levi's books, If This Is a Man, he recalls a time when he was deliriously thirsty and cold to the bone. He noticed an icicle hanging from the gutters outside his cell window, and he reached for it so he could hold it in his fist and lick the ice to quench his thirst. He stretched out to grab it, but a passing Nazi guard knocked it out of his hand, shattering the icicle. Primo asked one question, why? To which the guard answered in German, Hier ist kein Warum, which translates to, here, there is no why. That simple answer, by a mindless guard doing mindless cruelty to a young, starving scientist, has become the symbol for the Holocaust itself. In fact, the answer might hold a seed of truth for mindless cruelty going back to the beginnings of man. Why would anyone torture another person if it's not for land or power? Why burn down a building? Why throw a brick through a window? Why commit murder if it's not for passion or property? Here, there is no why. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Lemense, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no-duh on the internet and get to the facts.
There might not be a why exactly. The nature of mindless cruelty and malice is that it is mindless. But in today's episode, we want to at least explore why we have malice in us. What makes some of us want to knock the icicle out of Primo's hand? Maybe we would never do anything cruel to another living creature, but most of us would admit to enjoying violent video games or be fascinating watching a car wreck, seeing someone faceplant during a TikTok video, or smashing a window or TV when we were younger. We don't have to be camp guards, but on some level, at some point in our lives, we all felt the instinct for wanton malice. Where does this instinct come from? And why does it feel so good to indulge in malice acts, even if we can't stomach the thought of hurting someone? We're going to unravel the inner springs of malice, and we're starting with 3 myths. Myths like. Myth 1. It's in our DNA as humans to conquer, So maybe the fun we have destroying something is just leftover instincts kind of just leaking out. Myth 2. Okay. If cruelty and malice doesn't come from our instinct to conquer, then maybe the Nazi guards are cruel because they were ordered to be cruel. Weren't there a bunch of experiments like that? Like proved we do awful things if an authority ordered us. Myth 3. What about blame? Maybe we're secretly cruel for fun because we need someone else to blame for all of life's problems. We'll get into the inner springs of malice. But first, I want to talk to Joe about an earlier episode we did on meanness and the difference between being mean and being malicious.
Okay, so before we get too far, I do want to kind of talk about our intro, like our opening narrative. That is an extremely famous quote. There is no why here. And we just want to state from the start, this is not going to be a Auschwitz episode. There are lots of podcasts that cover that era of history, and there are lots of podcasts that cover what the camps were like. So we're not really going to dwell on that. We are just taking more of a holistic overall look at malice as a human condition. This also came from a weird side conversation that led to something much deeper and much more interesting. So I want to give a shout out to Dr. Jude Roberts, who recommended a philosophy book called Malice, and that's by Francois Flehault. I at some point I had the ear of somebody briefly who's very intelligent, and I asked a bunch of silly questions. And one of the things I asked is, hey, if we write about or draw art or do creative things about malicious stuff, does it make us malicious? Do we have monstrous instincts? Like Stephen King is asked very frequently, what's wrong with him? How messed up are you, man? And George R. Martin writes about torture, but I don't think George R. Martin tortures people for fun. So do we all have these instincts? If we're all willing to curb stomp people while playing Grand Theft Auto, does that make us monsters? So a lot of our episode today is actually sort of my attempts to fuse Flehault's work and philosophy with a little bit of science and statistics. So my apologies, Dr. Roberts, when we absolutely butcher what you tried to hand off to me in philosophy. And to get us started, I'm going to ask a question of Todd. Todd, have you ever heard of Vlad the Impaler?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So he's the conqueror who Dracula was loosely based on, at least the parts of like owning a castle, impaling people, torture, things like that. If you are wondering where that weird vampire accent comes from, it's Romanian, circa 1430s.
Broken English Romanian.
Right. Very liberally interpreted Romanian and put an actor's spin on it and a wig, and suddenly you've got Dracula. But he was known for doing extremely cruel things, malicious things. Very famously, he was called the Impaler because one of the events that happened was an army was marching on his castle. They were going to show up and basically, wreck up his day. And Vlad the Impaler took his own peasants, and history and fiction conflate how many it was, but he took a bunch of his peasants and impaled his own people outside his castle. And he did it in such a way, we won't get into the grisly details, but he impaled them in such a way to where they were still living, or some of them at least were still moving when the enemy army showed up. And they took a look at this forest of dying people who were still squirming hours after this had happened, and they said nope, and they marched away.
Sounds horrible.
Yeah. There's a good reason this is not a Vlad the Impaler episode, because we do not want to talk super grisly stuff more than just recognizing it so we can get into what makes us do what we do. But there is sort of an argument to be had there. What's the difference between meanness and maliciousness? Because Vlad the Impaler did some insanely violent and cruel things. But one could make the argument that he had a country or a kingdom to rule. He could have just been doing these seemingly insane, vicious acts because he was trying to hold power and keep power. So when you think of meanness, and we did an episode on meanness, could you explain what you consider mean, and does it have like a place?
And getting away from the extremes of dictators and kings.
Right.
The big one that always pops out to me is being a step parent or being a parent in general. Sometimes you have to be tough. You have to be strong, or else the kids will walk all over you. But sometimes you push too far and you can become mean. And how it shows its head in business is you can have a boss who is very structured, very strict, almost borderline mean, and that can get results because it sets really good boundaries. It sets expectations. But then when it goes to malice, Joe, is when the boss becomes unfair.
Okay.
Changing pay, firing people, becoming just a bully.
And we're going to try to get away from as many examples as we can of people who are being mean for a purpose, because we strictly want to talk today, as much as we can, about malice, which is you're not punishing somebody because you need to be a good parent or because you need to get results at work. You're punishing somebody because it's fun to punish them. Who is your favorite, super cruel, evil villain in fiction? Do you have like somebody who is like, mustache twirling, tie a damsel to the railroad tracks kind of evil?
I think of the Penguin. I think of the Joker, any of the Batman stuff. What I like about the Batman series is they're just so dead set on being bad guys. There's no good cause to their. They want chaos and horror.
I think it's a perfect example. I think that works better than my Impaler example, the Joker. If you ignore the newest movie with Joaquin Phoenix, most of the Joker's malicious evil acts, they are purely for fun. So I think that's a good way to look at it. Did you ever do anything that was like malicious as a kid or a teenager?
I had a lot of them, so I narrowed it down to two things that we used to do when I was a kid. One we used to do firework wars, and this is just what it sounds. This was probably when we were middle school, high school, freshman year. But we would buy Roman candles, which shoots fire out, and firecrackers, and we would go out and kind of play war with each other and shoot each other with these things. Well, I mean, it's terrible, Joe. People get shot in the face. You could lose an eye. I got the back of my hair burnt off one time. It just seemed so stupid, but it was in a way of dominating. And we would bully other kids into playing with us.
Right.
Who kind of didn't want to play. And I didn't realize that at the time until I get older. Fast forward a little bit more, a few years older, we used to have boxing matches with all my friends. And again, that was extreme peer pressure to partake in this. Well, it was pretty much the stronger kids beating up on the weaker kids, and that's mean.
Right. I think that, but now would you say that like a pecking order among friends does that have a purpose ever?
I think so, right? You have someone who is the leader and the followers and what do you think?
See, that's something I've tried to think about with this episode, is that camp guard that knocked the icicle out of Levy's hand. If he was doing that to like make sure he knew his place, like if he was trying to do it for a pecking order
with the other guards.
Yeah, you could almost justify it. You could say he's making the people in the prison afraid. He's making the prisoners know that they are powerless. And so that might be a purpose. But I kind of side with it. It just sounded just patently malicious. There was too much that happened at any of these camps where it was malicious for no reason and it didn't quite serve a power purpose, if that makes sense. I think that's the first argument we actually have to bust is if we're doing something malicious, does it bolster social standing? Do you remember in our episode about, ironically, Hitler Youth, where we talked about how risky teens will behave to impress each other?
Mm-hmm. And it raises your social status, and people are attracted to risky behavior.
Right. So there is some element of that, like you going to war with Roman candles. There might be a little bit of element of this is establishing a pecking order. It's also demonstrating that you're willing to engage in risky behavior.
Well, I've seen this with the police department. I have friends who are police, and when they're together, they'll talk about when they got into some kind of confrontation and how Officer Richards grabbed the guy and threw him on the ground. And you can see a chest puff and, wow,
right.
It's a good thing he was there.
Right. I guess this is sort of a big preamble to say we are recognizing that we sure as heck find a lot of ways to justify malicious behavior, whether that is through establishing pecking order, conquering, getting sexual rights, getting land. But we're going to sort of move past that all because there are moments in human existence where you're not shooting a Roman candle at somebody to establish a pecking order, or you're not doing what I did as a kid, which is take a crowbar to televisions at the dump. You're not doing it just to have a pecking order or to establish social order. You are doing it for fun.
Does it have to be all physical abuse?
No.
Can we get away from that?
We can.
The knuckle dragging, smash you in the face.
Right. If we get away from like the social standing thing, there's a great Louis C.K. interview, and he mentions that as kids, he did this as a kid, and he has seen kids do it where like they will call each other names or be cruel verbally just to see a reaction, to see what happens when you tear somebody down and what happens to their ego and their standing. So theory one, let's get into theories because we actually want to sort of like not put this myth to bed, but just explore where malice comes from according to, well, for scientists, then philosophical theories. We'll take it in that order. So science kind of sides with it's our need to dominate. The hyper-aggressive gamer theory, we'll call it. It's in our DNA to be aggressive. And when we play a game, we're being rewarded to conquer. We get a prize. In video games, it's what's known as the Skinner box. Loot drops from a body in Grand Theft Auto. You run somebody over with your car, a little stack of cash glows. It literally like makes a ding sound and it glows when it drops out. That reward is dopamine. It's dopamine in tiny increments, and that's what a kill in any game gives us. It's a tiny hit of dopamine. Now, that's not the same as our guard knocking an icicle out of Primo's hand either. I'm guessing Primo did not make a sound aside from, perhaps abject depression. One of the theories that I like a lot came from Malice, that being cruel to somebody else is kind of an expression of our own mortality. You and I have both had health scares, right?
Yes. Joe and I are a couple of old men talking about our cardiologist.
We just play chess in the park and feed pigeons whenever we're not on the microphone.
We try to figure out if we took today's pills or those were yesterday's pills. Or
I just use a random hopper. Like I don't use a pill organizer anymore. It just drops pills into my coffee.
But when you have a health scare, it changes your values.
It does.
100%.
Yeah. One of the theories is that, if you have a health scare, maybe you'll be more careful. Maybe you'll show that you care your loved ones more. Maybe you'll reorganize your priorities, do some things that you had intended to do. If you're younger and you are aggressive and you have a lot of testosterone, instead of doing that, you might take out that mortality, that frailty on somebody else. If you are, say, young enough to go to war and it's early man, like we're not going to do this with, Nazis, but say you are a tribal man and you have just gone to meet another tribe, you've clubbed somebody to death, and you, for no reason, are just taking it out on their tribe. The idea that you would be doing that might be a recognition of your own mortality or frailty. When you see something else basically wink out of existence, it gives you a sense of control over your own frailty, or so the theory goes. That if you feel vulnerable, you take that vulnerability out on somebody else or something else. We talked about in another episode the incel killer, Alec Manassian. And he went around, like he stopped in a car outside of a college, and then he went and started killing, he called them Chads and Stacys. They were just fellow students. But like, the phrase Chad is a way to refer to popular jocks, the guys that are like, classically handsome and, work out and stuff. And Stacey's is the word he used that comes from the internet for, basically women who are empty-headed, they go out with jocks kind of people, maybe cheerleaders. But he identified them as Chads and Stacys, almost like he didn't want to learn their names or refer to them as people or fellow students. The ISIS uses the phrase infidels. The Nazis referred to the Jews as rats.
They're not people. They're in this box. They're in this bin like animals.
Right. Yeah. We don't want to see them as people. We want to put a label on them. I really went with that theory for a very long time. In fact, if you had asked me 2 weeks ago why people are capable of doing malicious things, and we're going to get pretty heavy in this episode. We're eventually going to lead to what current genocides are going on in the world. So if you're hoping our Auschwitz talk was going to lead to a lighter, easier talk,
that things are better now. We've seen the error of our ways, and we would never allow this to happen today.
Right. We are currently allowing it to happen, and it's not for the reasons I thought. I really thought this was going to be a podcast episode where we land at, everybody who is capable of these things are looking at people as not people. They're putting them into these boxes. They're calling them Chads and Stacys, and they're ignoring their humanity. The reality is scarier, worse, and easier to manipulate. In fact, by the end of this episode, when I realized how easy it was to get someone to act maliciously, it kind of scared me a bit, and we will definitely get to that. But these philosophies, so this is mixing philosophy and science, don't want to do that too much, but these kind of explain a couple of things. Gamers blowing up buildings and kids wrecking TVs, that can just be empowerment. They don't feel like they're killing real people. Certainly some Nazi guards had this attitude also, which is, if you can identify somebody and be like, that's not a person, that's a video game character, you can do a lot more and get away with a lot more. Now, the next part we're going to get to, we will talk about why cruel, malicious acts might be done out of more of a moral righteousness. That is the scarier part. But first, I kind of want to talk about something you had posted in our episode notes, Ivan the Terrible. And I really liked this example. So I was wondering if you could tell us about a malicious... okay, first off, his name is Ivan the Terrible. So how bad could this guy be?
Ivan the Terrible was the first Moscow ruler, after it formed its independence. And he was born into it. He didn't conquer anybody or anything, but he was known to be a more than most cruel leader.
Okay.
And there's been a myth going on for years, and I heard this once, and it stained, tattooed, scarred in my brain, that he had this very, very famous, very talented, the best architect in the world. His name is Postnik Yakovlev. That after he built a castle for him, right?
Okay.
He had Postnik, so he could never create another thing as beautiful as his. He had him blinded. He had his eyes cut out.
Okay.
Well, so turns out that Postnik, after history has said he was blinded, he went on to create 2 more masterpieces of architecture. So there's a pretty good chance that wasn't true.
It may not be true, but if you work for Ivan the Terrible, even if he didn't have his eyes gouged out.
Ivan is definitely capable of it.
Okay.
Let me give you a few examples of that.
Please.
I was trying to find the top 1 or 2 things, terrible things, malice things that Ivan the Terrible did in his lifetime that's documented. There's so many, Joe. So I'm just going to give you a couple, but he is a horrible, horrible person. Ivan the Terrible beat his son's wife, who was pregnant, to the point that she had a miscarriage.
Good Lord.
So then his son, horrified, went and confronted his father. His father beat him in the head, poked him in the head with a pointed staff, and he killed his son. So he killed his grandbaby inside of this woman, and then he killed his own son.
Okay, that earns the name.
Now, this is going to seem like a strange one. He got married 8 times. Now, only 3 of those were in the church. So at the time, that was seen as, as terrible. You have to get married in church, especially if you're a king. But out of those 8 wives, 5 of them were murdered, and 3 were imprisoned. The only one that really lived was the one that outlived him. So instead of just getting a divorce, when he was sick of his wives, Joe, he would kill them.
I almost, hearing that first example, I almost wish he had just gouged out an artist's eyes. Like that almost sounds, there's no better here. There's no why here, but the myth sounded very rare. Is it that it's like you hear the myth and you're like, I wish it had just been that.
I think there's something when it's something personal, is when it's cruelty towards your own family too.
Yeah, maybe that's why it's so bothersome. It's his son. It's an unborn child. That's all pretty terrible. Have you ever heard of the Milgram shock experiment?
No, Milgram shock experiment.
So if Ivan the Terrible had just told his guard to kill his son, do you think the guard would have done it?
Oh, absolutely.
So that's kind of the gist of the Milgram experiment, is that if an authority figure, like a king or a czar, tells you do this terrible thing, you're gonna do it. This kind of came from post-Nazi Germany. So like after the trials to try war criminals, Milgram very famously did this shock experiment where he was trying to figure out how could these Nazi guards have done what they did. Like, how could you ever, he basically asked himself the same thing, which is, if I was told, murder this person horrifically, would I do it? So we'll just kind of start there. Is if I asked you, like the guard, of course, is going to do it if they're in the bedroom with Ivan the Terrible. If you are Ivan the Terrible's guard and I tell you murder somebody, do you think you would?
Yes, I would. And I also fear, even after I did it, you'd have a little too much wine one night and then say, hey, you killed my son.
Right.
I think it's such a lose-lose.
Yeah. At least Ivan did his own dirty work.
I don't know if that's where you go with this, but I'm already conflicted with my own saving my own neck here.
That is actually precisely where we're going with this. The purpose of the Milgram experiment was to prove that people, when told by a source of authority to do something that was malicious, they would do it.
Oh, because other people will say, I would never do that.
Until they're sitting there with their finger on the button. And that is quite literally how the Milgram experiment was designed. They would have two people in separate rooms. One person would sit in a room with a button. The other person would be in another room, and there's a wall between them. They can't see each other. And the person who was in the other room, not at the button, was strapped to an electrode. And they were told, we need you to read through this list, and it's, random words. And anytime, they had to remember it and then speak it back. And they were called the learner. And anytime this learner missed a word, they'd get shocked. They had a list of, say, like 10 different animals or something. If they, number 7 was dog. If they missed dog, zap. The true reveal behind this experiment is the learner, the person getting zapped, was an actor. They weren't actually in pain or trouble. They were being paid to pretend like they were, really being hurt. And the people who were administering the shocks, the people at the button, who were kind of like in their own room, blind, they were being told by Milgram and his scientists, this is for science, hit that button when this learner fails. And, the person at the button was also told, this is to increase human intelligence. With this button, you will advance science. We will learn how to teach people quicker.
You're actually helping people, big picture.
Right. So that was kind of the whole purpose of the shock experiment. And Milgram famously proved that most people, when told by an authority to shock somebody, would do it, even to the point where that person passed out. So in this experiment, the learner who was in the room would fake a heart attack. He would start screaming and be like, no more, please, it hurts. I can't take it. And Milgram would come on the microphone and say, the experiment has to continue. Shock the learner, zap him. And famously, he reported that most people would do it. Most people would hit that button and zap you. The problem with this experiment is that it was hardly ever repeatable. For a very long time, it was upheld as like this huge gold, standard of science, that it had found an amazing sort of mechanism in the human mind.
Breakthrough.
Right. We would listen to authority. So, Todd, knowing that about yourself, that if Ivan the Terrible told you kill somebody, or if Milgram said shock this person, it's for science, there is a percentage of the population that will do it, obviously. We don't know what that percentage is, and it's hard to repeat this experiment because there's lots and lots of variables that change it. Some people will do it more if they're told it's for a good cause. If they're told it's for science, if they're told, the person in the other room who is having that heart attack, they want this to go on. They, if they have a discussion beforehand or contact, it changes. There's so many variables. And then there's also like authority. If the authority tells you you will not be punished for doing this, it changes things. So
see this in war crimes.
Right, exactly. In fact, that's what Milgram was trying to sort of suss out is, can we accidentally repeat war crimes? If we don't learn from Auschwitz, are we doomed to repeat it because people are willing to listen to an authority?
Do you think some of that too is you would do this to me if you were the prison guard and I was the prisoner?
Well, that's a good question. Is how much of it is would you do it to a person you know? Because what we have found out,
I just meant if like the roles were reversed.
I think if somebody told me it was for a good purpose, like if somebody said it's for science, you're advancing the human, if you're advancing the human agenda, and this person has agreed to it and said continue no matter what, I would probably hit the button. But then again, emotionally, I don't know how that would work out. Like somebody might start screaming, please stop. And I don't know if I could emotionally handle hitting that button again. Now, true malice would be somebody hits that button for fun. They're sitting there, somebody's screaming stop. Yeah, Milgram does not have to come over the microphone and say, please continue. They just do it anyway. So that is kind of the third-ish myth we wanted to really bust, which is if we're not being malicious for land, titles, if we're not doing it for pecking order, if we sometimes do it because an authority tells us to, but it's hard to repeat, and a lot of people won't. Just straight up, a lot of people will refuse an authority if they say, do this cruel thing. There's sort of one trick, like internet articles that used to like BuzzFeedy titles used to say things like, do this one weird trick. Here's this one weird trick to get people to act maliciously. And I got this from a really fantastic article by Paul Bloom. This appeared in the New Yorker and in Vox, and it's all about human-on-human cruelty and why we are able to be malicious, why we have it in us to start being malicious and start listening to an authority. So first, I'm going to play a little bit of a game. What is a hardship that you have suffered in the last 10 to 15 years? Something that struck like everybody has faced COVID, financial ruin, medical bills, crazy stuff. Like this has been a wild couple decades. Is there one that has hit you in particular?
Just a personal thing that I've treated someone being treated unfairly.
Yeah.
Pre-recession 2007, 2008, I got what I considered screwed over at a divorce and lost the best job I'd ever had, and haven't found a job that I made that much and did that little since. Okay.
Would you blame the divorce lawyers?
No. Yeah. But it was as much a bankruptcy. It sounds more financial than it really is. It's just probably more emotional than it was financial as far as damage and, in my opinion, cruelty.
I don't want to make it sound like Todd would electroshock an ex.
Yes, I would.
But whether you blame the ex more for suing you into ruin, or whether you blame the divorce lawyers or whoever you put the blame on.
Cruelty. They work together.
Okay. Yeah. The everyone can imagine the sort of like the backroom conversation of we'll take him for everything he's worth, and then
what about you? What's yours?
Medical billing, absolutely. I was unfairly charged for every penny I was worth, and then later found to be in the right. But it took me a year to fight that back to get my savings back, and it was grueling and unnecessary.
So those people who collected that money and treated you like you owed them.
They did for a year, and I wanted to burn the system down. But that's kind of my point, is that it's really, really easy for us to, if you think you wouldn't shock somebody because an authority tells you to, or if you don't think you would knock the icicle out of somebody's hand, I can immediately convince you that you would do it. Take the thing that was the most egregious that has been done to you and just put them on somebody else. Like put that act on somebody else. So your ex and your divorce lawyer, the ones that screwed you over, if I had them in the Milgram experiment, I put them behind a wall and they had electrodes attached to them, and they were trying to learn a list of things. And I gave you permission to shock them every time they got it wrong, and it's for science. How would you do?
God, the X one's a tough one. I think I could do it. I think I could pay back, even it out.
Yeah.
I know my ex would want one too, because she's going to say he was no angel in all this.
Yeah. The medical billing companies that make it purposefully convoluted to write a medical bill, who are actively robbing thousands upon thousands of Americans of their savings. If you put them all, I don't mean
let's do it more personal though. Let's do the ones that were calling on yours and the ones that were ignoring your calls, and put you in a, he's not going to push back for much longer. We'll outlast him.
Yes, the people who willfully chose not to go through my union or through my coverage and billed me directly, and basically fought that until there are people who individually were at fault for that. If you put them in a pen, I'm not even going with the Milgram experiment, I'll go straight to Auschwitz. You put them in a pen and you tell me that the only way they leave is a chimney, I'd nod. I would just be like, yeah, do it. These people are ruining other people's lives, and it's at the cost of their health. Do it. Now that sounds really cruel and like I am just being an absolute bastard. But that is effectively how we get malice. Malice on an individual level, on a person-to-person level, it can be a philosophical question. It really can be what Francois theorized or talked about, that we may club somebody else over the head because we feel vulnerable and we need to prove we are not that mortal. It can be for pecking-order. It can be for all these reasons. But something that they talk about in this Vox article that we will definitely link off to, Paul Bloom puts it a different way. When he talks about mass killings or even slavery, he says that you basically start with a dehumanizing ideology and then just put up a system that promotes the dehumanization. If say Paul Bloom told me that he had everybody who had ever done crooked medical billing in a pen, and then he told me, these people don't deserve, water, I would agree with him. Like it would not be that hard to convince me. Later, if you started showing me evidence, if you took me aside, showed me their personal file, like their folder file, and said, this person has never worked in medical billing, they've never screwed anyone over, they're innocent, then I'd consider releasing them. Then it would be harder for me to do this.
You're going on a real power trip here.
I'm sorry.
I think you think this is a real life thing.
Yeah.
I can see you getting worked up.
I'm trying to sell you on the idea. I've got some wire cutters and barbed wire. We're making the pen. But okay, so as Bloom puts it, people do this because they don't believe they're killing people. This is... So we talked about that, the dehumanizing, what that, calling them Chads and Stacys allows you to do violence. And then there's obviously what happened in the Nazi concentration camps. Like people were reduced to machines or treated like animals for labor. But as Paul puts it, these don't explain the genocides that are currently going on. The way he puts it is if you merely thought of people as animals, you wouldn't get pleasure from doing these things. You can't humiliate an animal. You can only humiliate people. Somebody in a slaughterhouse, they almost never enjoy their job. They're just sort of mechanically going through it. So dehumanization is real and it's terrible, but it's not the whole picture, is the way Paul puts it. I'm just going to quote this real quick. Again, please go read this article because we're about to quote about 3 or 4 paragraphs directly from him. Paul says, first, there's this myth that people who do evil are psychopaths or sadists or monsters. The truth is more complicated. We talked about the myth of dehumanization. If only we could sit down and say, hey guys, the Jews, the blacks, and the gays, they're people just like you. We think evil would disappear. That is something I see in movies. This isn't Paul saying this. I'm just thinking about, if you watch movies that confront racism or confront any kind of ism or hate. The movies make it seem like if you had dinner with these people, whoever those people are for you, a group you hate, it would change your mind. Paul Bloom says that's not the case. He says, consider the rhetoric of white supremacy. White supremacists know about the humanity of Jews and black people and whoever else they're discriminating against, and it terrifies them. One of their slogans is, "You will not replace us." So if you think about what that means, that's not a chant that they would use if they thought that, they were being replaced by roaches or subhumans or whatever. That's a chant at people you're really worried about, people who you think are a threat to your status and way of life. When we talk about, the hypothetical whoever they are for, divorce lawyers or crooked billings people, that's us basically fixing an ideology onto a group of people. That's saying, here's the wrongs these people did. They are a threat to you and a continued threat. And suddenly we have an urge to be malicious to them. And again, I'll simply state what Paul said at the beginning of this. You have to start a genocide with dehumanizing ideology. You put something on them that they may or may not have done. In Hitler's case, he accused the Jews of being wealthier than everyone else, hoarding money, being selfish, keeping things from everybody else. And this came at a time when there was a historic depression in Nazi Germany. They were recovering after World War I, when they had basically been taxed to almost a crushing depression.
They're coming here, stealing your jobs.
Right, yeah. And suddenly...
taking food from your family.
Yep, they're depriving you. And then you put in a system that promotes that dehumanization, again, as Paul Bloom puts it, which is something that looks like a president or a prime minister or an acting governor that says, oh, by the way, those people we just dehumanized, we have cages for them.
You're talking about putting people in cages. What current day genocides are going on right now as we speak?
There are ethnic groups in South Sudan who are still currently being genocided. The Nur, for one, the Rohingyas in Myanmar. That's one that I definitely saw a John Oliver episode about. There are Christian and Muslim genocides going on in Central Africa Republic, Darfur in Sudan, and there's the Christian and Yazidi genocide in Iraq and Syria. All of these, if you can believe it, involve both those two major components. There's a political party or government that has identified them as wrong morally, and a civilian population who they've told you won't get in trouble if you are involved. And if you're wondering if money plays a factor, we can't do an episode without mentioning economy. Just like the depression that happened before Nazis were willing to punish rich people as they saw it. All of these groups, all of these genocides are spawning where there is huge wealth inequality. So they're not taking part in cleansings just because Milgram tells them press a button that will shock somebody. They are taking part in these genocides because they at first feel threatened or wronged and morally in the right. They're told this group did it, and then they're willing to do malicious things.
We all have malice in us, and we let out in little rebellious spurts throughout our lives. We trip a classmate for no reason. We smash a window as a teen. We play violent video games. We dominate in micro-tyrannies. But when we find ourselves being threatened, genuinely threatened by crushing debt, by a worldwide pandemic, or by just not having enough, by being surrounded by people who speak another language, we start dreaming up ways to push back. We start looking for people who took away all our opportunities the previous generation enjoyed. And there are lots of radicalized organizations who want to point at a group of folks and tell you they did it. They took away your health coverage. They put you in debt. They sucked up all the resources. Vote for me and we can make them all go away. Want to know what made Nazis do what they did? Want to feel what the Auschwitz guard felt when he knocked the eye skull out of Primo Levi's hand? If you're an American and you have debt or health problems, the answer is simple. Just imagine we've rounded up all the shady student loan companies. We've rounded up the opioid executives who sold drugs to 1 million overdose victims. We've imprisoned all the bankers who caused the 2009 recession and all the big pharma CEOs who have charged too much for HIV drugs. We have them all in a big wire pen right in the middle of Washington, D.C. And we've conveniently forgotten to give them water. If one of them is reaching for an ice skull, would you knock it out of their hands? Because what we did here, this little mental exercise, that's exactly how malice works. Take a mob of people and assign them morally outrageous crimes and let desperate people who've been hurt, be their jailers. What do you think would happen? There is no why here.